Hello and welcome to Chaotic Insights, where I break down the TV show Chaotic, and today we'll be talking about Season 2, Episode 10, Gigantempopolis. So grab a snack, start your laundry, and we'll dive right in. Episode summary: Tom, Kaz, Peyton, and Sarah explore Gigantempopolis to look for cool battle gear, but they discover the building that they are in is booby-trapped against thieves. So, Tom gets hypnotized by a statue and becomes greedy, and Blazer then comes and offers to show them the cool battle gear they're looking for. He speeds off, and then Tom turns on his friends and traps them in a room. Lorena saves the group and says she's lost Blazer while mapping the temple, and they follow Blazer's trail to find Blazer and Tom fighting over treasure. The treasure in turn being a giant laser that will destroy them. So, Lorena saves Tom from his trance and incapacitates Blazer to save them from the laser. In the end, they learn lessons like greed is bad and don't go to Gigantempopolis. Oh no, sis! So, right off the bat, we get a pretty explicit theme to this episode, and that is greed is bad, it's selfish, and it makes you do nasty things, which is fine and dandy. And both Blazer and Tom get overwhelmed with greed, so much so that they try to harm themselves and others. But here's the thing: they were not acting as themselves because they were hypnotized or entranced by this thief trap, by this idol with glowing eyes. So I feel like we just have to remember that. Like, yes, they were being greedy, but really they were hypnotized, and so it wasn't themselves that were being greedy. It was the enchantment, it was the spell that was making them feel greedy, act in the way that they were acting. So really it was a good trap for thieves. But I think that we just have to admit once again, Tom unfortunately is the villain of this episode, right? Sure, the real villain is maybe the trap, right? That the giants left behind. It's the giants who are long gone and this like enchantment idol that's turning people greedy so much so that they're willing to go to their doom. But narratively, in this episode, Tom is doing a lot of the heavy lifting here, right? And Blazer to some extent. Perhaps it's just me being another day being another certified Tom hater, but, is Tom the villain? In this episode, I fear he is. And that loops back to this theme of like greed is bad, of sure the enchantment is the villain and narratively Tom and Blazer are acting as antagonists, but with the theme of this episode being greed is bad, really what's happening is they're heightening greed, they're exaggerating the level of greed in Blazer, in Tom, to an extent that it becomes like a fatal flaw, like they're doing, greed is their hubris, if you will, in this episode. They're pushing it to an extent that it becomes exaggerated so that the lesson becomes even more clear. Now, another thing I want to mention is I think it's interesting here that we've seen both Lorena and Blazer before, but this is really the first time we get to meet them, except we're not really meeting Blazer because he is under this enchantment, he's under this spell. But here we're meeting Lorena, and things we learn about her: she's strong, she's brave, she's knowledgeable, she's a good leader under pressure. And it's interesting that they establish that Lorena and Blazer are like cartography partners. They're in this building so that they can create a map of Gigantempopolis. And up to this point, we know that Blazer was a spy for the overworld, and we know that he is a map person. But to put those two things together, I think it makes a lot of sense. Blazer's going places, he's spying, he's also making maps. He's really exploring the land. Now, I do think it's interesting this episode. We don't really seem to center on a specific character for growth, if you will. Like, this isn't a Peyton focused episode. This isn't a Kaz focused episode. This is really like a group episode. I would argue it's like a Tom episode because he's the dynamic character of, he goes from being possessed and greedy to becoming not possessed and less greedy. But I don't think it necessarily shows any character growth in forwarding his story like long term, because the plot in this episode is just undoing the plot that occurs in this episode. It's kind of self-contained in the way of like if the inciting incident is the booby trap and the idol that enchants Tom, right? Then the resolution is the disenchantment of Tom. And so at the beginning, the status quo is Tom is not enchanted, and at the end, the resolution is Tom is not enchanted. So we really didn't like push his narrative arc forward so much as we like took this brief little pit stop and had an adventure, you know? So I think that's interesting to point out about this episode is like we don't really progress anything forward so much as, you know, we learn about Gigantempopolis and, you know, we learn about Larina, but this episode doesn't have a lot of depth in that arena. And also, this isn't the first time that Chaotic has told stories about greed or like, you know, had a theme in this manner. For example, I think of The Curse of Korbeck, right? That is another episode where they're like, greed is bad, but it's much more subtle, and to me, I think it's much more effective because in that episode, it's like a more tangible example of greed. It's like three real creatures who were being greedy over the Song of Stasis music, and that ended up corrupting themselves and each other, right? And then they all died. Sad, right? So the lesson there is like, don't be greedy or you'll be dead. And the lesson here is very much that same thing of like, don't be greedy or you'll be dead. But this time, by laser. Um, but like, you know, this isn't the first time Chaotic has delved into this topic. And connecting it to what I said before, this episode is a lot more hyperbolic in their greed. You know, they're rubbing their hands together, their eyes are glowing, they're looking malicious. And so they push greed to a hyperbolic state, whereas comparing and contrasting the Song of Stasis, Curse of Korbeck episode, they're not, you know, they're not rubbing their hands together saying treasure. That story is more so told in a way of this is like one thing that could have hypothetically happened, and, you know, now we learned from their mistakes versus, you know, again, comparing and contrasting this episode is like, we are making the mistakes because we're possessed. I think you can see how I feel about the possession is it adds this like barrier in between the audience and the world of Tom or the world of Blazer for me because they're not acting as their true selves. And to me, that makes the theme drive home a little less hard, which I think is why they brought it to a more hyperbolic state. Things to think about. Let's move on to lore. So we have Gigantempopolis. Say it 5 times fast because I cannot. It truly has to be such a large scale of a city compared to, right? If you look at the size of our humans, if you look at the size of Blazer next to this giant world, or even like, you know, the characters climbing the stairs. Like the average height of a stair is like 7 to 11 inches. Let's say 8. Let's say it's, you know, 8 inches tall. And so they've turned it into like 8 feet tall at least. You know, and so if 1 inch is every foot, Gigantempopolis has to cover so much just like sheer mass, like land volume in Param. Gigantopolis has to be huge. And just like considering the scale, considering the size of what the creatures must have been in order to walk up those steps, and that it's not just one building, right? It's not just one building that is remaining from the giants. We see like a whole cityscape. And so, you know, if you take one city, multiply it by 10, that's a lot of land area. And so Gigantompopolis has to be huge on this map. Now, we do get a little bit of backstory, and that is that there are giants who used to live here, and for whatever reason, those giants got wiped out. We were told that they eventually disappeared, but it's theorized that they're wiped out. So either way, it was deep in the past. Like, we don't know what happened to the giants, but we know that they're not here anymore. We also know that they left behind cool gear and other treasures, and that, like, these buildings still survive to the modern day. But we can also assume that normal-sized creatures, like, Blazer and Lorena-sized creatures, also existed at the same time as the giants, because there are these um, tiny entrances, right? They wouldn't have a tiny door if there wasn't a tiny creature, right? And they wouldn't have a tiny entrance filled with booby traps to stop thieves if there weren't tiny thieves that needed to be stopped, right? So the logic makes sense that there are tiny creatures alive at the same as the giants, if you will. And that gels with the story of, they left traps for the thieves because if there weren't thieves, there wouldn't be a magical idol that entraps thieves, heightening their greed and taking them to their doom. You know what I mean? And so, just like canonically, it makes sense that there are tiny people and giants at the same time. But somehow the giants died out, and now we're left with the tiny people. We also learned that in the modern day, Almar uses Gigantempopolis as a grounds to use his giant robot, whether that's testing it out or whether that's, using the giant robot to navigate the giant world, like whether he's exploring or whether he's just using it as a testing ground, we're not sure. But they do mention it twice. They mention Ulmar twice, which I think is noteworthy as just like something. There's something there that they could dive into if they want, but here it's just, it's just mentioned. Now, maybe we learn a little bit more about the giants later on in the series, and we will circle back to that when we circle back to that. But until then, we learn about this gem or crystal that messes with people's minds that's implemented in the statue, right? We know that crystals or shards have powers here in Chaotic, and so we're just adding another one to this like menu of there's something in this idol that increases greed. Now, is it greed specifically, or is it like increasing some kind of flaw? I think the hypnotic state, there's some sort of power there in that crystal, and in that gem, in that statue, let's jot that down. Something like this exists in Chaotic. But I think it's important to note that it also like transfers knowledge to you because both Tom and Blazer know about the hidden room behind the treasure. Behind the vault is this like doom room that only exists as a trap. And so being hypnotized by the statue, it gives you that knowledge of not only is there treasure locationally, like this treasure is in the treasure room, it also gives you that knowledge of there's a better treasure behind it, and that better treasure is like macabre. So on to fun facts and other notes. On the menu today, we get a Param pizza fully loaded, and I would describe this episode as Wipeout meets Indiana Jones meets Toy Story 3. And I think that's a good comparison of this episode, right? You first get there, it's obstacles. We're in Wipeout. Time the doors onto Indiana Jones. They're adventuring, they're looking for treasure. Into Toy Story 3. This episode has always reminded me of the incinerator scene in Toy Story 3. And you watch the episode, I'm sure. You understand why, I'm sure. They're all holding hands, like it's different in this episode because they're like actively trying not to die versus like in Toy Story 3 they're all hold hands and like accept their fate. But the mechanic of the scene still works the same of they're in an incinerator room with, giant laser in the middle, if you will, and sloped walls, they're slowly sliding in. Just mechanically, the scenes work very similar in my head. And so if I had to give this episode a log line, it's, Wipeout meets Indiana Jones meets Toy Story 3 with a lesson, with a warning, don't be greedy. So another note I wrote down is I thought it was interesting that when Kaz, Sarah, and Peyton are trapped in that room, there is a trap there, but that trap seems to be different. The one that Lorena saves them from, she saves them from a swarm of like mechanical bugs, which I think doesn't align aesthetically with the other traps, right? The other traps are more Indiana Jones, and this trap is more technologically forward. And so I'm making the connection with they said Almar a couple times. If Almar messes around in these parts, maybe he made this swarm of mechanical bugs, or maybe he's trying to guard something that's in this region, and he left a trap as well. You know, like timeline wise, if the Giants were left long ago, they wouldn't have this like up to date technology, right? They're using the hypnotic idol. And so there's a theory there somewhere. Like, what are we hiding? I think it's interesting. And my last note is Lorena. I just want to talk about Lorena because this is really her main highlight, I think. Like this episode, we get to really showcase Lorena. And she's awesome. Like she's cool, but her character design is very Damien coded to me, right? She looks like a bug. I'll say it. She looks like a bug, but green, you know. But I think it goes to show like one of Chaotic's overarching themes is about seeing nuance and having individuality. And I think it goes to show like how Tribe Allegiance once again isn't about anatomy. Like Lorena is built like a bug, but she is not a Danian. And right, so like if you were just to look at her, you'd be like, oh, maybe that's a Danian. But it's not. And so I think it goes to show like it takes getting to know a creature. It takes, asking them questions, and you can't like assume tribe allegiance based off of their look. Don't stereotype the creatures. Let's talk about final thoughts on this episode. My final thoughts are this episode is fine. This episode isn't life-changing for me. I would say it's fun to learn a little bit about Gigantempopolis and see like the booby traps and the treasure and whatnot. And this is really like an action-focused story. There's a lot of action here, and like there's no chaotic battle. This is a param-focused story, which simplifies the story structure a little bit. And so to me, this episode, it is action focused. I don't think like none of the action in this episode I point to as like some of my favorite action in the series. But also like I feel like it lacks that emotional depth that I'm looking for. It lacks heart. This episode lacks heart in a way that I feel a tangible connection with. The ending, it does always remind me of Toy Story 3, and so like that's just something that happens to me. Like, sometimes people have the same idea at the same time, and you make that connection. But I do wonder, like on a macro level, why this episode is included in season two like this, right? To me, it doesn't set up anything significant for the rest of the season, or not off the top of my head at least, right? And so far, season two has been very intentional about building blocks towards like what's to come. And this episode, we learn about this new place, we learn about lore, and it does come back in the series, but it doesn't necessarily affect season two specifically. And so like why is this episode ordered in the way it's ordered? Why is it coming now? And so that's a question I have. But really, I do like this episode. I remember seeing it a lot in my youth in reruns. And so like I don't hate this episode. To me it's fine. You know, lower third for chaotic lower third's still good. But it just doesn't hit my checklist personally. And so that's kind of, a light analysis, a little bit of lore we get. Because it is such a surface level story, I think there's not a ton to really like dive into off the top of my head. But if you caught anything that you want to talk about, let me know. And with that, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.